The heavy chamber doors groaned, buckling inward under the force of a thermal charge. Queen Zilia pressed her back against the cold stone of the bunker, her eyes locked on Elias. He stood in the center of the room, a jagged piece of rebar in one hand and a pulse carbine in the other. If the Vaelarian shock troops breached this line, the ascendancy would fall before dawn. Would you risk everything on a stranger who promised you peace but delivered a war? Subscribe to see how the gardener bloomed into a god. 2 months earlier, the hardest decision Zilia had faced was choosing which silk to wear for a wedding she didn't want. The human arrived on a rusted transport, carrying a crate of Terran seedlings and a quiet, unassuming smile. Elias Vance was meant to be a political sacrifice, a botanist sent to appease the Vaelarian court, while the diplomats argued over mining rights. He spent his first weeks in the palace dirt, hands stained with soil as he worked on the neglected royal gardens. Zilia watched him from the high balcony, noting the way he moved through the thorns without ever sustaining a scratch. It was a strange grace for a simple farmer. She found him one evening kneeling by a patch of moonshade lilies. In his hand he held a delicate, translucent glass vial containing a single, dormant Terran blue briar seed. It looked like a tiny, frozen star. He told her it was a hardy thing, capable of surviving in the harshest environments, if given just a little bit of care. Why Earth sent a gardener to a queen who only understands steel, I will never know, Zilia said, her shadow stretching over him. Elias didn't look up, his fingers steady as he pressed the seed into the alien soil. Steel can't grow, Majesty. It only breaks. The observation was punchy, but his actions spoke louder. A week later, she caught him in the training courtyard. A young guard seeking to humiliate the human consort had challenged him to a spar. Elias hadn't used a blade. He had simply stepped inside the guard's reach, a movement so fluid it was almost invisible, and redirected the soldier's momentum until the Vaelarian was face down in the gravel. Beneath his rolled-up sleeves, Zilia saw them for the first time. Scars. They weren't the messy marks of a brawler, but the precise, faded lines of surgical repairs and high-velocity projectiles. In fact, the palace felt different with him in it. The corridors seemed better mapped, the maintenance shafts strangely clear of debris. She realized he wasn't just planting flowers. He was learning the bones of her citadel, covered in alien blood and moving with terrifying silent efficiency. The unassuming botanist drops from the bedchamber shadows to snap the neck of the elite shock guard before a single plasma bolt can be fired. The midnight coup began with the smell of ozone and the screaming of sirens. Grand Marshal Kaluk had struck with surgical precision, jamming the royal frequencies and flooding the residential wings with gas. The glass shattered. Run, a voice whispered from the dark. Elias was there, but he was no longer the man who smelled of damp earth and lilies. He moved like a shadow given teeth. The shadows of the maintenance tunnels were narrow and smelled of ancient dust, a stark contrast to the garden's open air. Elias didn't speak. He simply guided her with a firm hand on her shoulder, his movements as certain in the dark as they had been in the soil. He knew every junction. He knew which pressure plates were decorative and which were lethal. Zilia watched the back of his head, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the man she had called a diplomat. This was the man the Ascendancy had dismissed as a peaceful gardener. "They're coming," Elias said, his voice a low vibration. A heavy metallic thud echoed from the corridor behind them. The Grand Marshal's elite units were not far behind. Elias pulled a small, circular device from a hidden pocket in his tactical Vestan object. He must have had since the moment he stepped off his ship and rolled it back toward the pursuers. A muffled explosion rocked the floor, followed by the sound of collapsing masonry. "The communications bunker is just ahead," he grunted, his breathing finally beginning to raggedly accelerate. We called a Hyperion. We end this. Which meant the human was never just a husband. He was an anchor. They reached the reinforced doors of the subterranean vault just as the secondary alarms began to wail. Elias shoved Xylia inside and slammed the manual override. He didn't look at the consoles. He didn't look at the screens displaying Kylok's face broadcasting a victory speech to the terrified masses above. He looked at the door. The heavy chamber doors groaned, buckling inward under the force of a thermal charge. Xylia pressed her back against the stone, the air thick with the smell of scorched metal. Elias stood in the center of the room. He had no shield. He had only the raw, terrifying lethality of a species that had spent its entire history learning how to survive. When the breach finally gave way, it didn't happen in a flurry of laser fire. It happened in a red blur. The first 5 shock troops were dead before they could clear the threshold. Elias didn't shoot. He moved. He was a whirlwind of broken bones and snapped necks, using the confined space to turn the Vaelarians' heavy armor against them. Even as a plasma bolt seared through his shoulder, he didn't stumble. He caught a soldier's throat in his hand and used the body as a human shield, his eyes burning with a cold, professional focus that made Xylia's blood run cold. He was a weapon Earth had hidden in a velvet scabbard. By the time the Terran Marines from the dreadnought Hyperion cut their way into the bunker, the silence was absolute. The room was a graveyard of 15 elite soldiers. In the center, Elias sat slumped against the primary terminal, his face pale, his hands still trembling as they clutched the jagged rebar. He looked up at Xylia, and for a fleeting second, the assassin vanished. The gardener was back, weary and broken. "Gardens are going to need a lot of work," he whispered. Months later, the scars on the palace walls had been polished away, but the scars on the man remained. Xylia stood with Elias on the restored royal balcony. Below them, the gardens were no longer a neglected ruin. The Terran blue briar had taken root, its vibrant azure petals weaving through the silver vines of the Vaelarian lilies. The glass vial that once held the seed sat on the stone railing, now filled with water in a single blooming hybrid. It was a fragile, odd novelty no longer, but a symbol of a peace bought with blood and maintained with devotion. How much of what we love is just a mask for what we need? Come back tomorrow to see if the next truth is just as sharp.